Hello and welcome back to another update. As we start out with a short update on the Marinka front, then we move on to the upcoming, what I would believe, the upcoming Kharkiv offensive by the Russians. So we start out in the direction of Marinka, where the Russians managed to make advances here to the northeast and to the northern parts of Marinka. In the northeastern parts, the Russians managed to advance and capture the trenches east of the industrial zone here northeast of the Marinka front, and they managed to capture the trenches here located in this location. With this advance, the Russians now are closer to the positions of the Ukrainians here to the west, towards the opening fields and Krasnovarivka itself. And with this, they would have secured the northern flank of Marinka, and with this, there should be no forward positions by the Ukrainians. There may be some trenches and fortifications all throughout the fields where there will be a lot of positional fighting over the next coming weeks and months. But other than that, there will be no potential for the Ukrainians to threaten the Marinka direction with direct fire from the north with this advance. We'll likely see the Russians advance to capture the forest lines here to the northeast of Marinka. But other than that, we'll see the focus being on a westward direction, where the Russians have entered Kharkiv, both in the southern and northern parts of the west of Marinka, where they've now captured this church area right here, the half of the field here to the north, and advance within the city outskirts. So with this, we see that there's continuous advances by the Russians in the direction of Kharkiv here after the capture of Marinka in the end of December. We then move on to the Kharkiv direction, where I will go over what I believe will be the upcoming scenario for the Battle of Kharkiv. First, we start out with some preliminary information, and that is the current size of the Russian army. We know that with the partial mobilization at the end of October last year, or the previous year, now 2022, the Russians mobilized a little bit above 300,000 soldiers. This in addition to 2023, where throughout the year, according to Putin, 486,000 new soldiers have signed contracts with the military in 2023. They also mention in this AP article that the mobilization law prevents the soldiers serving in Ukraine from terminating their contracts, and that it is open-ended, so they can serve as long as is needed according to Russian law, and therefore these 300,000 in addition to the 486,000, which adds up to 786,000 additional soldiers to the front. In addition to that, if we estimate that the UK Defense Ministry's estimation is real, it is true, and Russia has suffered 150 to 190,000 permanent casualties, that would still be 600,000 additional soldiers to the 175,000 estimated to have started the war, in addition to the DPR-LPR soldiers and potentially some PMCs like Wagner returning, Chechens and so on. All of that would add up to over 800,000 soldiers that could be committed to the war in Ukraine, and that job is fighting the war in Ukraine. At the same time, we have Putin saying only 617,000 are fighting in Ukraine. That leaves about 200,000 soldiers not fighting in Ukraine. 200,000 soldiers is enough to open up a new front. So is it possible that Russia could start a new front in Kharkiv? Yes, it is. Is the weather suitable? As I mentioned in my previous video, it will turn to -10, -15 degrees. So after the snow has fallen, there's a clear day with -10 to 15 degrees Celsius. The ground is completely frozen. It is perfectly suitable for an offensive operation. This has also been transmitted from the MI6 to the Office of the President in Ukraine, according to a leak from the Office of the President. Therefore, there is the potential that Russia will launch an offensive towards Kharkiv. Now the question is, how will it happen? Going back to the oldest recap of Deep State Map, we have the 3rd of April 2022. And the reason I went back to this date is because it shows where the Russians were advancing, where they were fighting at the start of their initial attacks towards Kharkiv. This was not an operation to take the city. It was an operation to isolate the city from the Russian operations in the east and in the south. So what we see here is that there are multiple directions where the Russians entered from and multiple targets. One of the main targets is here to the east from the Luhansk direction towards Izium here in the west. They also took control over Kupiansk, Balaklia here to control the flank of Izium, and the main road from the Russian positions to Izium actually comes from the north, where the Russians took control over the villages here to the east of Kharkiv and moved down south towards Balaklia, after which they moved down to Izium, and then there's also the connection towards Borova and Kupiansk from the east. If we take that into the same position we see today here in the Kharkiv direction, then it would be the Russians entering from the main roads to the north, moving down south towards Veliki Burlak, down south to Juhuiv here in the west, down to Balaklia, and then in direction of Izium from the northern direction. From the eastern direction it would be towards Borova and towards Kupiansk. This is something that could repeat again, except this time the roads aren't really needed, because at the initial start of the invasion the Russians attacked when the ground was muddy, the ice had frozen, the snow had frozen, and the terrain was unsuitable for military operations. However, this time around it is suitable for military operations, so they can go through and enter from any point throughout the front line, considering that the ground will be frozen. Therefore, we are likely to see the Russians entering from different areas than specifically the areas with the roads, and they don't need to follow these roads specifically. However, we will likely see the targets being the same: Borova, Kupiansk, Balaklia, Izium, Juhuiv, in the east of Kharkiv, and the targets or the entrance from the Russian positions would be in the north, and from the east from Svatove and Kreminna towards Liman and Borova and Kupiansk here in the north. To capture these, they would end up capturing the northern flank of the Donetsk region. They will also be able to pressure Sloviansk and Siversk from the north. They would gain control over the east of the Oskar River line, and they would be able to start pressuring Izium again, which is a main hub for any sort of passing through the Severodonetsk River here in the north. Izium could also be used to launch further operations in the northern direction to attack Kharkiv from the south. However, if the Russians' target would be to capture Kharkiv rather than just isolating it, then they would need to launch operations in the northern flank as well, which if we look at the deep state map area, they did not. We only saw them attack directly towards Kharkiv to draw in the Ukrainian units in the northern direction as they launched their main operations here in the east towards Izium and Balaklia. So with this we see that the Russians will likely do the same, where they launch attacks directly towards Kharkiv to try and pressure the Ukrainian positions there. However, we will also likely see attacks in the northern flanks, not towards Sumy. It is too far away and it is not necessary if a battle over Kharkiv persists. Instead, they would need to capture the areas where the roads interchange and connect with each other to cut off the supplies going to Kharkiv. Looking at this somewhat useful railway map over Ukraine, we can see that the main connection with Kharkiv goes through Poltava, and then there's from the south from the Zaporizhia and Dnipro direction. If we look at the map here, we can see that the directions towards the Kharkiv direction from Dnipro and Poltava connects here from the south. There's no major connection, but there is also a rail connection from Sumy to Kharkiv. So the Russians would need to cut off the southwestern parts of Kharkiv to cut off from the supplies from Dnipro, Poltava, and Sumy. Their targets here in the south would be to reach and capture Izium again, as that would cut off the rail connection between the Kharkiv direction and the Donetsk direction. So they would need to gain control over Izium, and they would need to cut off the western parts of Kharkiv. So we'll see two main push by the Russian forces. They would need to launch a main push towards Izium and a main push to the northwest of Kharkiv. If the Russians will launch an offensive towards Kharkiv, those are the two areas that will be focused on. And at the same time, there will also be a push towards Liman and everything east of the Oskar River line. This is why we're seeing a large concentration of Russian soldiers and armored vehicles in this direction, as has been talked about for months, yet the Russians never launched anything. That's because they are preparing for a long-term operation which hasn't started yet. What we're seeing so far is just positional fighting. We are also likely going to see more buildup of Russian soldiers and armored vehicles if it is going to be reported on publicly, if the Russians are going to launch an attack towards Kharkiv. So what I'm saying is that this attack is not guaranteed. It is, however, very likely, considering the abundance of Russian soldiers that is not committed to the front right now, either because they are on rotation or because they're preparing for this offensive, and the weather is optimal for offensive operations in the Ukraine war. The reason why the Russians would be interested in such an operation is, first off, if the Ukrainians are seeing themselves as being in a position where continuing this war is detrimental for their goals. For example, if they stop believing that they can recapture territory, then they would be interested in signing a peace. As such, they would prevent and avoid losing more territory. So the more the Russians look like they are stronger, the more that they look like they can capture more territory, and the more they look like their defenses are solid, the more likely the Ukrainians would look to siege peace. However, the Russians also need to agree to this peace. So if a Russian offensive is launched towards Kharkiv and they manage to capture Kharkiv, and if the Ukrainians then follow up by launching a counterattack and they failed doing that, then the Russians would have a very huge possibility for a very good peace deal, because in that scenario they would have proven that they can yet again launch offensive operations after building up enough forces and capture territory. And if they manage to prevent a Ukrainian counterattack, then they would be able to prove that they're also able to hold on to their territories. So that would be the two targets of Russia. They need to prove that they can capture, they need to prove that they can hold. Otherwise, the Ukrainians would not agree to any peace deal, as is the case so far, because they believe the Russians will not be able to capture more heaps of territory. They instead believe that they can just continue this war until they finish the amount of soldiers they have available, the amount of offensive capabilities they have, and then when that is over, then they can seek peace in a ceasefire, freeze the front situation, as is parroted by Western media. However, that is not going to be the case. We're likely going to see the Russians launch multiple offensives in the future, try to capture territories, because they have so far not given up on the different positions that are on the front line. And the Western narrative is that Ukraine will be able to recapture everything, while the Russian narrative is that Kharkiv and Odessa specifically are Russian cities. So they will likely see some sort of push to capture those two. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.